Well, good evening. I will be speaking today about an initiative that is going to be on the November 3rd California ballot that would affect the way that property taxes are imposed on California commercial and industrial real property. It would not affect residential property, either single family or multifamily. The initiative, if it passes, would be the most significant development in California property tax law since 1978. It hasn't received a lot of attention, or at least not as much attention as one would expect given its magnitude, since it qualified for the ballot at the end of May, probably because of all the other major news that has taken place in 2020, but it would be quite significant. So the law that's being changed is what we know as Prop 13, which is also in the California Constitution and which also came about by the initiative process. And Prop 13 applies to all real property in California, residential, commercial, agricultural, pretty much all real property. So prior to Prop 13, and in fact the law still in most states has property taxes based on the value of the property. That is, taxes are a percentage of that value. What Prop 13 did and continues to do establishes a base value for the real estate, and I'll explain what that is later, and determines a property tax based on that base value, and then allows the property to be reassessed and taxes increased only in limited amounts. So that, and those limited amounts are that the taxes cannot increase more than the lesser of 2% or the rate of inflation annually. And there are exceptions to these limits, and such that the property can be reassessed and taxes changed, either increased or decreased, if there's a change in ownership of the property or if there's new construction. So what is base value? In 1978, when Prop 13 first came into effect, base value was the value of the property in 1975. Now a property's base value is generally set at the time of change of ownership. So it's generally the property's purchase price. So I'll give you an example. Say you purchase a property in 2015 for $1 million. Your property taxes at that time are then calculated based on that value. So $1 million is considered to be your base value. As long as you own the property, taxes can only increase at that limited amount of the lesser of the rate of inflation, or 2%. If you sell the property in 2019 for $1,500,000, the purchaser is going to pay taxes based on $1,500,000. Also, if while you own the property, you make major improvements to the property such that its value is increased to $1,200,000, then you'll pay taxes based on $1,200,000. The other concept here that's worth mentioning is, what is a change in ownership? Certainly a sale is the easiest thing to think of as a change in ownership, and that's what I mentioned in the example, but other things might also constitute a change in ownership, and there's a great deal of law on what that constitutes. So for example, if you're in a partnership and there are two partners, and you transfer it to, the property is transferred to a limited liability company in which there are two members who have the same proportionate interest, that's not in change of ownership. If there are three members, that is a change in ownership. Some of the more interesting cases also come up when the property owner doesn't change, but the ownership of the entity changes. So for example, if a corporation owns property and there are shareholders in the corporation, and they sell those shares, their shareholder interests, but they don't sell the property itself. So the owner of the property never changes. But that is also considered a change in ownership if there's a change in ownership or control. So anyway, there's a great body of law on this, and I spend time doing this with transfers to determine property tax consequences. But in any event, so that's Prop 13. So what does Prop 15 do? Prop 15 is the initiative that's going to be on the ballot in November. So what it would do is say that starting in January 1, 2022, it would split the tax roll so that the Prop 13 regime that I just described would only apply to residential properties in the land on which it's situated. And as I said, it's single family or multifamily residential. And with respect to commercial and industrial, the taxes would be based on value. And the assessors are charged by the new initiative to determine value at least every 3 years, and then owners would have to pay taxes based on those values. So the limits that I mentioned before in Prop 13 about the lower of inflation or 2% just wouldn't apply at all to commercial and industrial property. So there's a presumption that this change would lead to increased property tax revenue, since the value of most properties increases more than 2% a year. And the state legislative analyst estimated that the fiscal effect of enacting Prop 15 regarding the commercial and industrial properties would be that there would be an increase in property taxes between $8 billion and $12.5 billion annually, depending on the strength of the real estate markets. So these increased amounts, this increased amount would first be used to reimburse the state for shortfalls in the personal and corporate income taxes. The idea being here that if an owner is paying more in taxes, they have less income, then therefore they're paying less in income taxes. And so the first use of these increased revenues would be to reimburse the state treasury for those decreases in income taxes. But then the increased revenues would be used to pay counties, primarily county assessors, for the administrative costs of implementing the new system. And so the net that's left after reimbursing income taxes and paying county expenses has been estimated to be between $6.5 and $11.5 billion. And that amount would be allocated about 60% to cities, counties, and special districts, and about 40% to schools and community colleges. And the initiative has the formulas for how these allocations would work, about 3 pages. So they're fairly detailed provisions about which entities would get what percentage of the increased tax revenues. So the initiative would exempt certain commercial and industrial real properties from its scope, and so the exemption would, those exemptions would be as to a commercial and industrial real property with a fair market value of $3 million or less, unless any direct or indirect owner also has other property in the state that is that causes it to be greater than the ownership to be greater than $3 million. In that case, basically it's a $3 million limit on the exemption. The initiative would also have personal property tax exemptions for all property taxes on tangible personal property and fixtures owned by small businesses, which are defined as a business that has 50 or fewer full-time equivalent employees. And the rationale for this exemption is that it would, not having to pay those taxes would allow small business owners to reinvest those amounts that they otherwise would pay in personal property taxes, reinvest in the business. There's also an exemption for all taxpayers for personal property taxes of up to $500,000 on tangible personal property. So another sort of concession to small businesses is that the initiative, if it's passed, would have a delayed effective date for small businesses. As I mentioned, the initiative provisions would go into effect on January 1, 2022. However, if more than 50% or more of the square footage of a property is occupied by a small business, the change won't be effective until 2025, 2026. The property, the initiative also has a phase-in period. Again, it normally is effective January 1, 2022, but it provides for a phase-in of over 2 or more years to ensure a reasonable workload and implementation period for county assessors, and including processing assessment appeals. And that phase-in period is also for the benefit of taxpayers who would have that period, that approximately 2-year period to 2 or more year period to determine how they're going to pay the taxes. And the initiative generally gives the legislature the authority to enact provisions that would implement these measures. So I wanted to speak some about the support for and the opposition to the measure. And I would say that it's substantial in both cases. On the support side, and for those of you who are familiar with the initiative process, the initiative is proposed. It has to have a certain number of signatures to qualify for the ballot, and this measure got substantial support, and certainly one of, if not the highest number of signatures required to qualify an initiative. And their arguments, the supporters' arguments, are first that all other states, and pretty much all other states, property taxes are based on value. I was speaking a couple of weeks ago to a national group of real estate lawyers that I belong to, and I was talking about the initiative, and they didn't get what the issue was when I mentioned that in California, if this passes, the taxes on commercial and industrial property would be based on value, because that's a given. But as I mentioned, in California, we have, because of Prop 13, we have this limit on the amount of taxes. But in any event, the proponents say that this is just causing California to be in line with what's done nationally. The other thing that the proponents say is that the 80% of what they call the underassessment now of commercial industrial properties really goes to the benefit of only 8% of property owners. So the underutilization or the undertaxation really only benefits a small number of commercial and industrial taxpayers. And so it's not that a broad imposition of a burden on all the rest. And yet those taxpayers, that 8% of taxpayers, still get the benefit of the property taxes that are paid by other taxpayers. So, because the schools and the public district benefits. The proponents also say that even with the Prop 15 change, California would still be paying some of the lowest taxes in the country, because the tax rate, once you determine the value, the tax rate is not changing. With Prop 15, it's still the 1% tax rate would still apply. They also state that the extra funds are needed to pay for schools and local communities that are now underfunded, and that this really represents an investment in our future. The proponents assert that the current Prop 13 regime actually discourages the improvement of property, because again, new construction improvement leads to a reassessment and higher values. And so they're saying that properties aren't being improved, so that doesn't occur. They also state that having Prop 13 apply to commercial and industrial encourages properties to sit idle, which contributes to a number of issues, but one of which is the state's affordable housing crisis. They also assert that small businesses are protected because of the $3 million exemption that I mentioned, and also the personal property exemption. The opponents of the measure are also significant, and most of the large business owner advocacy groups in the state have come out against it. So the California Business Roundtable, the California Chamber of Commerce, the California Taxpayers Association, that was the group that originally proposed Prop 13, a group that I'm involved in called the International Council of Shopping Centers, ICSC. And what the opponents say is that if Prop 15 is enacted, it will cause businesses to leave the state. And certainly you can see this, for example, in the case of the owner, for example, of an older building that has appreciated in value, but as to which the owner is still paying lower taxes because of the effect of Prop 13. And so what the opponents say is, you know, an owner like that will sell the building, take the benefit of the appreciation, and relocate. Certainly, however, you know, I've talked to a number of people about this, including industrial brokers, and not all businesses, and, you know, necessarily agree. Certainly owners who have acquired more recently or who have made improvements more recently and therefore have had their taxes increased, you know, a lot of them think that the enactment of Prop 15 will level the playing field, so to speak, because right now they feel that they are competing against older buildings in terms of getting tenants, because those owners of older buildings are able to charge lower rents because their taxes aren't as high, you know, assuming they do, but they have the ability to do that. And so, you know, enacting Prop 15 and causing them to pay higher taxes would kind of level the playing field. At least that's what the owners of some of the newer buildings think. One of the most significant points that opponents make is that Prop 15 will harm small businesses because the increase in taxes that owners pay will just be passed through to tenants, who will ultimately be the ones to bear the brunt of the initiative. And as a commercial real estate attorney, I mean, I draft, you know, commercial leases all the time, and it is the case that, you know, an owner, landlord's property taxes are passed through in leases to tenants who pay either all of those taxes, for example, in a triple net lease where maybe there's only one tenant, or a tenant may end up paying its proportionate share of property taxes, for example, in a, you know, retail and office where there are multiple users. But the bottom line is, I mean, I've never seen a commercial lease where tenants didn't pay the taxes. And so what the opponents say is that while the measure, you know, tries to protect small business owners of real estate with the personal property tax exemption and the $3 million exemption, it doesn't protect small business tenants or any tenants, because in effect the increased taxes on commercial industrial that would be imposed by Prop 15 are going to be passed through to tenants. Another argument made by the opponents is that the enactment of Prop 15 would just exacerbate the effect of COVID-19, since, you know, tenants have, you know, been affected by COVID-19 and they're not paying rent, but yet owners would still have to pay higher taxes. Now, given Prop 15, as I mentioned, doesn't come into effect for several years, but, you know, the opposition is looking at this, you know, through the lens of what's been going on this year, and see that as another impediment or another issue in the initiative. The measure has been opposed by the California Assessors Association, who indicate that enactment of the initiative would impose a huge cost on them. The quoted amount was between $430 and $760 million in increased staff needs and increased tech needs. And the last argument in opposition that I would mention is that Prop 15 is just the first step towards taking Prop 13 protection away from all California real property, that it only applies to commercial and industrial, but really the intent is to next go after it in terms of residential. And certainly, that is not what the initiative states. And the initiative was on the ballot, qualified for the ballot in 2018, went away primarily because of the amount of the real property exemption, came back, still didn't, go after residential real property. But on the other hand, you can see the argument possibly that, just as two identical pieces of property or two pieces of property that have disparate treatment, commercial and industrial have disparate treatment just based on the time of the last sale, you can make that same argument based on residential property, where a homeowner who moves in 2000 might have a similar house to someone who moved in 1980, but their taxes are substantially more. So, so that's that argument. It's also the case that, the whole argument of the proponents that 80% of the value of the underassessment of commercial real property that exists now because of Prop 13 goes to 8% of the owners just doesn't apply in the case of residential property. So that is the initiative, and it's as I said, it's quite major, and I encourage everyone to become informed about it. Thank you.